Welcome to Channel's Business Globe with me, Juliana Olayinka, reporting from just outside the Palace of Westminster in central London. Coming up on today's show, Africa's voice in the evolving global order. I sit down with reputation strategist Harry Burns, the founder of Lightfoot Advisors, to discuss how the continent can shape its narrative amid shifting geopolitical power blocks. And Moronike Ajayi, founder of Career Nuggets, joins us to talk about building a future-proof career in an era of automation, AI and global restructuring. Then later, highlights from Honourable Abike Dabiri-Erawa's visit to the Mayor of Barking and Dagenham. We'll show you how the chairperson of the Nigerians in the Diaspora Commission was warmly received by the youngest mayor in the UK, Councillor Princess Obayemi Bright, an inspiring moment for African leadership. But first, a landmark vote on assisted dying has taken place in the House of Commons, where MPs approved the terminally ill adults end-of-life bill by 314 votes to 291, advancing it to the House of Lords. The bill authorises medically assisted death for mentally competent adults in England and Wales with a life expectancy of 6 months or less, subject to approval by at least 2 doctors and an independent panel of experts, a measure designed to protect vulnerable individuals. With public backing at around 73%, this vote marks a significant shift that could see the UK join a small number of European countries permitting physician-assisted dying, pending further debate and legal refinement in the House of Lords. A man has been found guilty of murdering 14-year-old Daniel Anjorin in Hainault, East London. On April the 30th last year, Michael Aduri Monzo, 37, went on a 20-minute rampage with a samurai sword after first driving his van into a pedestrian. He struck Daniel, a schoolboy walking to school, and inflicted fatal neck and chest wounds. The jury at the Old Bailey convicted him of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, aggravated burglary and possession of offensive weapons, rejecting his claim that a drug-induced psychosis negated responsibility. Daniel's tragic death has sparked renewed calls for urgent action on online knife sales, improved mental health interventions and community safeguarding measures. Elsewhere, on Thursday, Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer addressed business leaders at the British Chamber of Commerce Global Annual Conference, pledging to maintain economic stability, support small business and reposition Britain as a global champion for free trade. The Prime Minister also referenced recent trade agreements with India, the US and the EU, calling them a hat-trick that protects jobs and secures long-term growth. He urged global investors to take another look at Britain, affirming his government's commitment to restoring trust and competitiveness post-Brexit. Earlier in the week, the Prime Minister pledged to strengthen the UK's defence contributions and lead efforts towards a more unified NATO response to emerging global threats. Speaking at the summit in The Hague, Starmer reaffirmed Britain's cast iron commitment to increasing defence and security spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. He outlined plans to allocate 3.5% to core military capabilities, such as personnel, equipment and operations, and a further 1.5% to broader national security, including cyber defence, border protection and energy infrastructure. He also announced the UK would supply 350 advanced air defence missiles to Ukraine, funded through £70 million in interest earned from frozen Russian assets. Additionally, he confirmed the purchase of 12 US-made F-35A jets capable of carrying nuclear weapons. Calling for allied unity, Starmer urged NATO members to maintain a strong coordinated stance against continued Russian aggression, emphasising the UK's renewed commitment to global security. Well, for more on this, I was earlier joined by our Downing Street correspondent, Simon Pusey. Simon, so Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer had a whistle-stop tour to The Hague earlier this week. Of course, a huge NATO meeting with one item on the agenda, really, which is trying to find world peace. He's had favour with Donald Trump over the past couple of weeks, but it seems as if Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, took away all his shine. But most importantly, there was an agreement amongst the allies to increase defence spending. Talk to me about what happened over those couple of days.
Yeah, so Mark Rutte now is the NATO chief. He used to be the head of the Netherlands, and so has known Donald Trump quite a long time. He's a career diplomat, career politician. He knows the talk. Pretty smooth talking. Yeah. Looks pretty good, sounds pretty good, knows what he's doing. And he sent a load of texts to Donald Trump as he was on Air Force One going over to this big summit, saying, congratulations, Donald, you have managed to get us to spend 5% increase on our defense spending, 5% of GDP. Congratulations, no one else will be able to do this. And congratulations on your peace deal with Iran. And he was just buttering him up. He's buttering him up. But Trump then tweeted them in real time. So you can see on the tweets that he sends out, puts on X, a minute ago. He sent a minute ago. He must have just been like, yes, boom, yes, boom. And then obviously all the journalists are saying, hey, Mr. Rutte, is it true that you said all these things? And he said, yeah, you know, it's kind of... and then there's this extraordinary moment where he refers to Donald Trump as being the daddy of this, and then obviously the journalists pick up on that and say, you know, if you're daddy, does that mean everyone else in the
are your children?
Are your children?
Yeah.
And I guess, you know, that's going to happen, but there is this kind of feeling that everyone is tiptoeing around Donald Trump. Everyone is trying to.
It was obvious, though, wasn't it?
In the past, he said, what's the point in NATO if we're spending all this money on defence and they're not? We may as well break up the alliance. And I think with Russia doing what Russia are doing, there is worry within NATO countries, especially those bordering Russia and Ukraine, Poland, and those Eastern European countries. What happens? Does Article 5 come into play now with the US? You know, if one of us is attacked, does that mean all of us are attacked, which is what Article 5 says? And if the US pulls out of NATO, then what's really the point? Because they are the main military force. So I think the whole point was to make sure Donald Trump still believes in NATO.
Did it work?
Well, he came back and the White House has mocked up this thing saying, welcome home, daddy, and there's a whole song about it. So, you know, maybe it did work. You know, maybe basically massaging his ego is how you sort of win favour with Donald Trump. There were other things that were announced at this summit. You know, there was more money for Ukraine, more support for Ukraine, new drones for Ukraine.
Did Trump meet with Zelensky?
He did, yeah. So Zelensky was there, and, you know, that needs to continue. You know, we need to put that, I think, from the NATO perspective, they need to put that White House dressing down that Donald Trump and JD Vance gave him a couple of months ago. They need to put that behind them. They need to sort of move on. And obviously Russia are not there. So, you know, it's important
opportunity
for them to all to come together. And I think it went as well as it could have, really. But yeah, the most important thing I think at the moment for NATO is that the Iran-Israel ceasefire holds, which it currently seems to be, shaky though it is. And, you know, stroke Donald Trump's ego, make him happy, make sure he remains in NATO, continues to give money to NATO, and you know, the American military support is there.
And very briefly, takeaways from Starmer?
Well, Sir Keir Starmer, I mean, he was sitting next to Donald Trump nearly the entire time. You had Mark Rutte on one side and Sir Keir Starmer on the other.
Well positioned.
That seems to play well. And, you know, especially as he's on shaky ground back home, we've said before, you know, with this welfare bill that may or may not go through, and he's got a big rebellion on. It's nice for him to be able to go away to Brussels and then come back and say, oh, look, you know, look how well Britain is performing on the world stage. We are acting as a mediator between the US and NATO and the US and European allies, and he looks quite statesmanlike abroad, whereas he comes home and he's still, you know, got fires everywhere, and that's the same for a lot of leaders. But it kind of is a feather to his bow that he can go out and he can look good on the international stage, even though at home he's on sort of shaky ground.
That's right. There's peace at the moment, well, in some parts of the world. Peace is all we want, Simon. Peace for another week at least. Thank you.
Thank you.
With global institutions under pressure and alliances shifting fast, reputation, influence and storytelling are more important than ever. Harry Burns of Lightfoot Advisors joins me for some insight into how African leaders can navigate current dynamics. Harry Burns, it's been a while.
Pleasure.
It's very interesting talking to you about this topic of what I would consider a void, I think, from African voices on the global stage at such a huge time. I was speaking to my colleague Simon Pusey just a moment ago, and we were talking about Rutte and him calling Trump daddy, and there seems to be a love fest of leadership in the global north. What's happened to the voices in the south?
Well, I think people are reluctant to put their head above the parapet. People don't want to be forced to take a side in any of the major conflicts.
Why?
I think when President Ruto went to the States a couple of years ago and he was asked, you know, are you going to look west or are you going to look east? He said, I'm going to look forward, which I think is a really good line. I think it sort of sums up the tightrope that African leaders are trying to walk. They don't want to incur the wrath of the US president, but they also don't want to isolate China, you know, who are obviously massive investors on the continent. They're building schools, roads, stadiums, government buildings as well, and they're really building up that sort of, you know, that soft power across Africa and building up that goodwill towards the Chinese people. And so so African leaders don't want to be forced to take a position either way.
But where does that leave the continent? You know, we want an opinion. We don't just want to have to go to The Economist or the FT. We or Channels TV. Yeah. We want to look to a leader to give us that sort of support. Do you think that that's to the downfall of Africa?
Well, I think there are leaders. You know, I think President Kagame, to be a president of such a small country on the continent,
Talking about the president of Rwanda.
Yes, of course, yeah. He punches well above his weight diplomatically.
Really?
Because I think Rwanda understand the importance of multilateral institutions. So
I haven't heard Rwanda say anything about what's going on in the Middle East.
Well, I think that's because they would say that it is not their place. So Rwanda, I think, mirrors a lot of other countries in that they want to focus on their own country and on their own region. They don't want to be forced to take a position on foreign wars that are, way beyond Africa's borders. And that's the way that they can keep moving the country and the continent forward without being dragged into geopolitical fights, which have caused so much damage across Africa over the past 100 years during the Cold War. With so many countries picking between the Soviet Union and the West, and I think people have learned lessons from that, and they think no, we're going to focus on Africa's problems. We're going to find African solutions to solve the issues that face Africans, and we're going to let the world carry on, without us, without our involvement.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think most people agree with you. I agree with you. Of course, it's much safer to keep quiet than to annoy President Donald Trump. But of course, the fallout in Gaza, the fallout in Ukraine does have a ripple effect in Africa. It does,
but how are they going to help? I think just by taking a position one way or another, it doesn't mean you're actually it's not going to lead to the end of war.
So you don't think we should make our voice heard on big global issues?
No, I definitely think that that African leaders need to be heard on the issues that affect Africans. So climate change, for example. I think trade, exactly.
Migration.
Yeah, and when you
arms sales.
Yes, yeah, yeah. I mean, of course, we live in an interconnected world where everything affects everyone. However, I think it's you're on a hiding to nothing if you are bullied by the global powers into taking a position on an issue which ultimately isn't going to affect the daily lives of their populations.
That's quite interesting, actually. So how would you suggest Africa position itself going forward in terms of living in Trump's world?
So I think in today's world, it's increasingly difficult for governments to be heard. I think particularly when you are trying to put out accurate and serious information from governments, it's so often drowned out by misinformation and disinformation and the swirl of media that we are all forced to live through just by looking at our phones. So I think governments have to work harder than they've ever done before to be heard. So they have to be smarter, they have to deploy new technologies, looking at AI. Governments need to build their own sovereign AI capabilities so that they're able to respond to misinformation, that they're able to get government messages out in really engaging formats. I think that the days have passed of issuing a statement, doing a press conference, doing a press release, and then that being heard by people. Nothing is cutting through. So governments have to get more creative with their content. They have to really push the envelope when it comes to taking risks with what content they push out, so that stuff is actually getting picked up by their populations. Because I think all too often you only hear the one guy with the massive megaphone of X. That is cutting through to people. So I think governments have to do everything, they have to be everywhere, and they have to do it all at once if they want to be heard by people.
Coming up on Channels Business Global, Moronike Ajayi, founder of Career Nuggets, joins us to talk about building a future-proof career in an era of automation, AI and global restructuring. And I'll be sharing highlights from chairperson of the Nigerians in Diaspora Commission, Honourable Abike Dabiri Erawa's visit to the Mayor of Barking and Dagenham, Councillor Princess Okbayemi Bright. All of this after the break. Do stay with us.